So I'm heading to a call this morning. This lady's been losing power to her house intermittently. So the power went out and she called the electric utility and they told her to check the main breaker. She checked it, reset it. Power came back on, but apparently that's been happening the last couple of days. She reset the power and power went back off again. And so my point this morning isn't so much what I'm doing specifically, but what I'm thinking about as far as troubleshooting goes. And when it comes to troubleshooting, troubleshooting starts long before you get to the problem and you get your tools out. So this morning, my troubleshooting of this specific problem started when I called her and the questions that I asked her. I asked her when the problem started, what she did about it, how often she's been seeing the problem, what were the symptoms of the problem, so that I can get an idea or narrow down what the issue might be or where it might be at. My thought process for troubleshooting when the problem first comes up involves me asking questions, collecting information, and realizing that the customer, if they're calling for an electrician, they have no idea what the problem is. So what they think the problem is probably has nothing to do with the solution. So they're just guessing. So I will take whatever they say with a grain of salt and rarely trust what they say. Whatever they tell me, I just consider it as symptoms to the problem, because they don't know what they're doing. Otherwise they would have fixed it themselves. And that actually goes for other electricians that tell me what they think the problem might be if they haven't been there. Or even if they have been there and the problem is not resolved, I'll still troubleshoot the problem myself. So I just wrapped up at the customer's house and no repair today yet. So sometimes when you're troubleshooting, if the problem does not exist while you're there, if you can't find the problem or see the problem, if it's an intermittent problem and it doesn't happen while you're there, then there's really nothing that you can do. I tried to duplicate it with a few things that I suspected that it might be, like if there's a loose connection, you try to see if you can find that connection, but the problem was not evident. So basically I just gave my contact information to the customer and told them to call me as soon as the issue comes up again. I told them a few things to look for as far as breakers and circuits and lights that might indicate where the problem is, at least for me to be able to look. So getting back to what I mentioned earlier about asking questions, when I talked to the customer initially this morning, I had asked a few specific questions about what was going on to get some answers and collect information. So I used that information when I got there to look at the equipment and narrow down my process so I wasn't all over the house. So I don't want to get in the weeds on the technical stuff. The point here is not to go through the details step by step of what I did. I'm trying to explain my thinking process, and when you're troubleshooting, you have to factor in anything that you can think of that might affect the problem. And in this case, we have multiple circuits in a provision, the main breaker, sub-panel, the breaker for the sub-panel. And so all these things could factor into the issue. The panel is newer, that's a factor. The house is very old, that's potentially a factor. You have overhead lines, that's potentially a factor, because a lot of the connections that are on the overhead, I shouldn't say a lot, but sometimes that connection on the overhead, when the utility terminates on the feeders coming out of the riser, sometimes those connections can fail. And also, let me just say this about troubleshooting generally, especially for you younger guys, apprentices, or young journeymen that might be kind of getting your feet wet with troubleshooting or service. There's no one way to troubleshoot, just like there's no one way to do an electrical installation. And just because someone troubleshoots something one way, you know, it could be a peer of yours, it could be a senior journeyman, master journeyman, could be your boss, a supervisor, it could be someone who thinks they know everything. There's no right or wrong way to troubleshoot. Now, you can get stuck on stuff, and you might not see something, but everybody's going to troubleshoot things differently. That's why when someone tells me that there's a problem, if they're a peer and if they make suggestions about things, about how to troubleshoot or what the problem might be, I usually blow it off because I'm the one doing the troubleshooting. You know, I have my method for troubleshooting, and that's different than the method that anybody else uses for troubleshooting. So I take any input with a grain of salt if I'm going to be the one out there hands-on. And I learned this in the early days, even as an apprentice when I first started doing service. You have to do your own troubleshooting. You have to ask your own questions. You have to make your own mistakes. You have to collect your own information. And for some guys, they're a little more hands-on. They want to troubleshoot by getting their tools out and their meter and start tearing everything apart. You know, that's fine. You know, like I say, everybody has their method. But when it comes to troubleshooting, you have to do it yourself. I'm always a little leery of people who say you got to do things a certain way. You know, that's actually part of the reason why when you call for an estimate, you got to call more than one guy. There's different ways to do things. You know, just because one guy says that you have to do installation a certain way doesn't mean that that's the only way to do it. If you ask 100 electricians how to do something, you're going to get 100 different answers. And the same thing is true with troubleshooting. There's different ways to troubleshoot. Now, there's efficient ways and better ways, but you know, everyone has their method. And especially, it's interesting, especially the guys that have been around a long time, they get set in their ways. And a lot of them think that their way is the best way. That's not always true. And that's even true of the stuff that I say. You know, just because I say it doesn't mean that it's the best way or the only way. You know, because every situation is different. You know, everyone's experience is different. The things that you've learned over the years. That's why I don't really talk, I try not to talk about the specific thing, you know, the technical, the how-to stuff. Because every time you could troubleshoot a circuit with a switch and a light bulb, you know, there could be 10 different things wrong with it. The situation you're looking at might be different than my situation. It might be different unknowns. So that's why I try not to talk about the technical stuff. I like to talk about how to think, not what to think. So how to think through something. How I think through something. I got a gift from a customer today. Best kind of gift you can get. I did want to say one other thing about talking to customers when you are troubleshooting, whether it's a business owner or a homeowner. You know, they don't understand electrical lingo and code lingo and all that stuff. So you can't talk to them in very technical terms. You know, a lot of guys like to make themselves look smart by using big words and stuff. You can't do that with customers. When I ask someone a question, if I'm troubleshooting something, I ask an owner a question about the problem they're having, I'm looking for a specific answer, and I don't want them to be confused by the question that I ask them. So I always make my conversation and the questions that I ask very simplified for their sake so that they can answer it in their terms. You know, sometimes when I'm talking to someone, before I start digging into it, if I ask them about something and they go on a run-on sentence or they start chasing rabbits about this and that in the house, a lot of times I'll have to ask the same question over and over multiple times in different ways until I get an answer from them. You see, some guys don't realize that troubleshooting is a skill. And not everybody has that skill. Some guys don't want to troubleshoot. Some guys don't like troubleshooting. Some guys don't know how. But not every electrician is a troubleshooter necessarily. I guess to some degree, every electrician is a troubleshooter, but some guys just don't like it. Some guys like new construction. Some guys like doing industrial. Some guys, want to be a supervisor. But troubleshooting is something that you can develop, you can get better at, you can learn. And as far as I can tell, there's really no school on troubleshooting. There's no book that tells you how to troubleshoot. I mean, I have a couple of books, and I've gone through parts of them in the past with you about troubleshooting and the process of troubleshooting, but it's not something you learn by reading or studying necessarily. There's kind of a philosophy behind troubleshooting. It's not code. But troubleshooting is something that you learn by doing. A lot of guys are confused by troubleshooting. Actually, a lot of guys on here. This is why my Instagram is not really made for electricians, maybe apprentices. It's really geared towards the non-electrician, the consumer, the realtor, the homeowner. Because electricians take this stuff and they want to make it more complicated than it is. And really that's the problem with a lot of guys. And, troubleshooting is not just something that takes an electrician to do. I mean, you got automotive guys that troubleshoot cars and stuff. But a lot of guys make things more difficult than it needs to be. And troubleshooting is the epitome of the craftsman who knows what he's doing when he can boil down the process or the system or the circuit to very simple terms. I've mentioned this before. The guy that I learned troubleshooting from is not even an electrician. And I've been in pickles before doing electrical work, and I got stumped by stuff. And he's the guy that I call. I mean, he lives in the Dominican Republic now. But I still call him for troubleshooting advice. Because it's not so much about understanding electrical work itself or the code itself. Like I say, troubleshooting is a thought process. It's an understanding of how things are supposed to work, and how that equipment or those pieces of the system work together and how they're supposed to operate. And then you ask questions based on that.